Good evening and welcome to The Jury, the show where we prosecute political correctness, revive the dying art of respectful disagreement and give the average Aussie a voice. Coming up on tonight's show, Florida has banned children under 14 from joining social media. Should Australia follow suit? Mortgage holders wait with bated breath every month for the RBA to hand down its rates decision. Should the Treasurer keep his emergency powers to override rate calls? The debate over banning gas in newly built homes heats up. The Liberals will go head-to-head with the Greens. Plus, we put the government's botched immigration detainee bill to the test. And for the sake of the cows and faded curtains, should we abolish daylight saving? There they are, this week's jury, ready to weigh up the arguments and deliver their verdict. We'll hear from expert witnesses and your Sky News favourites. The courtroom is now in session. Let's get into it.
Sky News Australia presents The Jury with Danica DiGiorgio.
Children under 14 in Florida are now banned from joining social media platforms, while those 14 or 15 need a parent's consent to sign up. The restrictions come after Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill into law which will fine companies up to $50,000 per violation.
Trying to help parents navigate this very difficult terrain that we have now with raising kids.
The laws are in response to a string of tragic suicides in the US, teens taking their lives due to cyberbullying. And it sparked a renewed debate here. Cyberbullying is the cause of at least 3 suicides per week in Australia. Despite its downfalls, social media is viewed by many Aussies as a necessary evil in the modern world. Our first question for the jury is, should Aussie kids 14 and under be banned from social media? Joining us now is psychologist Claire Rowe, who says yes, along with psychiatrist Tanvir Ahmed, who doesn't support the ban. Hello to you both. Thanks for being our first panel this evening. Claire, why do you think kids under 14 should indeed be banned from social media?
Just makes sense. It's following the science. We absolutely know how disastrous social media is on young children. It is, for their mental health, their connection with peers, their sleep, their physical health, concentration, focus. It's wide-ranging. And I absolutely think we will look back on this of us giving social media to 8, 9, 10-year-olds like we do with mothers smoking while they were pregnant in the 60s. We will think, how did we allow these children access to this? And I think there is no other way other than banning it through legislative means, because it's impossible for parents not to give them social media when everyone is on it. So as Ron DeSantis says, I think it will empower and assist parents in saying no. And, we only need a third or half of the kids to be off it to empower the rest of the parents to say, no, not everyone has it. It's against the law. You cannot have it until you're 14 or 15. I think 13 is too young. I would go 15 to 16.
Yeah. Look, that's a fair call. Tanvir, as Claire says, the science is behind it, but why do you think we should not indeed ban it?
Well, I'm not convinced of that. Banning social media is a bit like saying just say no to drugs or never have sex, teenagers. It's not going to work. You need to help them navigate the world they're in and be good digital citizens. There are all sorts of dangers of social media, whether it's harmful effects, cyberbullying, and it can often magnify things that are already going on in the real world. But we need to help kids be good digital citizens. They have to learn how to navigate it. And parents, schools, regulatory bodies can enable a framework to help them do that. So absolutely, regulate the companies that can pull out harmful content, not have age-appropriate limits, all of those things, you can regulate that heavily. And parents, there's lots of evidence saying parents trying to be hard-headed, this actually affects their relationship with kids. Social media is an extraordinary technology, and the brains of this age, I agree with Claire that they're vulnerable brains, right? But if you say them, don't touch this till you're 15, 16, they actually have no idea how to be good digital citizens at such a critical time of human development.
Yeah.
So, and then a lot of them, at the moment, if you're not on social media at age 13, 14, you're a social leper, right? That's not a reason not to ban it, but I'm saying it's such a critical part of the world they're in. It would be impossible to actually implement, and it'd be far better to regulate the environment, be better parents, involve schools, and let them become great digital citizens, which is an absolute central part of the world we live in.
Claire, it's everywhere, social media. How can you escape it? This is the problem.
Well, you cannot teach a 9-year-old to be a good digital citizen at 9 years old. What a burden on a 9-year-old with a product that is completely made for the one purpose of addicting them to that product. It's like saying, well, why do we allow them to use, alcohol and drugs? I mean, that is such a burden to put on a child. And we know now within households, should government be out of this and should it be left up to parents? Yes, I do think it should be. However, that's not happening. And this is the biggest mass experimentation on a generation that we have ever seen. And the results are disastrous, suicidal results, And so, I just don't think...
Used healthily, it is an extraordinary communication device. They get access to all this amazing information. They connect in all sorts of sophisticated ways that we weren't even able to. I see it in my teenage girls. Yes, it has to be regulated. Parents have to help them communicate this world. How many texts do I send? How do I do this? There's all these complexities, just like face-to-face communication, and we learn it as we grow older. Yeah. They need help. They need regulation. Yeah. But banning is not...
But as we mentioned in the introduction, Tanvir, cyberbullying is a cause of at least 3 suicides per week in Australia. 3 suicides per week. Surely that statistic is enough to say something needs to be done.
Social media is rarely the cause. There will always be lots of other things. These kids may have all sorts of other vulnerabilities. The online world often magnifies whatever else is going on. So the healthy social person uses social media in a healthy way. The depressed person can use it as an unhealthy way. Yeah. So, again, we have to help them impose the limits, a regulatory environment, and let them use it, or help them use it, in the most beneficial way. Not say, hey, not stick our heads in the sand and say, no, don't touch it.
I would argue there is plenty of time to do that at 15 years old. At 15, 16, 17 years old, kids are at home. There is so many years there to teach them with a further developed brain and some more maturity. But the fact that a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old is choosing to stay inside on a screen on social media, forget their connections, forget their childhood of play, forget exploring all that stuff, and is completely addicted to a screen. And parents are throwing their hands up. And yes, should parents do it, like Tanvir is saying, that is a utopian world. Sure. They should be doing it. It's too hard for them. I think we need to step in and ban it.
Let's get some juror feedback now. Belinda in the back row, you're a parent yourself. How do you feel about this issue?
Yeah, look, and every kid is different. I watched my son. He can use social media very responsibly. I watched my daughter, and the effect it has had on her, it's really, really negative. She's actually just come out of the psych ward because of depression, self-harm, and all the things. She locks herself in her room with her social media. As much as I want to parent that and teach her the right and way of doing it, I can't. There are other influences out there in the world that are stronger than my voice. And unfortunately, as much as parents want to do the right thing, we're fighting a losing battle. And I think as a 14-year-old or 13, 14, 15-year-old, they're establishing those friendship groups and those social connections at a personal face-to-face level. They're trying to navigate that social world getting into high school. And that is hard enough. And those early years, and it's actually established that year 9 and 10 are the worst years for girls in school, because that's when they have the most issues building those social connections. I would actually say that social media should be treated like alcohol and drugs, because it is. It's a drug. Yeah. It is an addiction.
That's a fair point.
And I think, it's hard to police. And even how do we know the tech companies are actually doing the right thing by our children? Well, there is no check when you say, yes, I am 18, when you sign into these apps.
Yeah, there's no proper ID check, no licence check. Sarah, what do you think?
So I would agree, but I think banning it's not setting kids up for the real world. Unfortunately, that doesn't take into account there needs to be some education and there needs to be some responsibility taken from the tech companies. And at the moment, they're not. You should be able to click on something to say, well, I'm not happy with this content, and they should pull it down and they should do something about it. And they're not doing that. So I think that's the issue.
Yeah, and they should be taking some of the blame for this. They need to be involved in the conversation. Rachel, what do you think?
Yeah, look, totally agree with Sarah in that social media outlets need to take more responsibility. Once you upload content into these outlets, they own it. So they've got to be far more responsible for their content. I think prohibition is not the answer either. I think we need to educate our young people more on on using social media.
Which goes back to Tanvia's point, but I want to pick up on what Belinda said. She said parents are fighting a losing battle, Tanvia, and that gets to the heart of this problem. Is it time to take it one step further and ban?
Parents need help, I agree.
Yeah.
And I think that's where regulating the companies, being really hard on them. And schools are helping too, banning phones for, restricted periods. Yeah. All of these things do help parents. Social media, look, it's a bit like fatty food, where we have biological vulnerabilities and these new technologies come and they can co-opt it. Social media's power is that it co-opts our biological need for social connection.
Sure.
So hugely powerful. That's the addictive nature of it.
Yeah.
We get cheap hits.
Yeah.
A 10, 11, 12-year-old is not equipped. The brain is not entirely equipped. That's where the idea of banning comes from.
Yeah.
But banning is going too far. They need to learn in a little way. It's like if you give them you give your cheeseburger a 10-year-old, you're not going to give them that every day, right?
Sure.
We need to find ways to do that
Yeah.
with social media and our kids.
And Claire, some have said that a ban wouldn't eliminate risky behaviour and it would just send kids underground and make them more reluctant to actually seek help if they need it. Where do you sit on that?
Yeah, that is an argument to be made. I still think that those are good arguments to be made in later teenage years, and I still think that when we're talking about a ban, we're talking about primary school ages. Okay. We're talking about 5 to 11-year-olds primarily, right? That we want off this, yeah. And I still think, like one of the juror members said, that parents are fighting a losing battle because when that child comes home and says, "But everyone's on it," and that's where they're having their discussions, Mum. That's where the conversations are. I'll be left out. These parents are going, well, I don't want that to happen, so, there you go. But no parent wants them to have it. And so if we ban it, it will help parents be able to say, no, it's against the law, you can't do it.
Look, it's a tough argument. You've both had your say. It is now time to call on the jury. Jurors, you have 10 seconds to decide, should Aussie kids aged 14 and under be banned from social media?
I don't think so. I'm sorry. That's fine.
Jury members, what have you decided? OK, we've got 1, 2, 3 yeses and the rest of you say no, that Aussie kids should not, under the age of 14, be banned from social media. Sandra, why yes?
Well, they found out when they stopped children having their phones in the school that kids were actually talking to each other, not texting each other. They were laughing, they were having debates, they were learning how to conversation, they were making their friends, they were playing in the fields. You want them to be able to do that. You don't want them sitting in a room, a closed-in room, texting and not talking to the person sitting beside them.
Yeah, that is a good point. I guess that's one of the pitfalls of it. Peter, what do you think?
Simply, I think parents need help. I think it's very difficult, as per the example in here, if your child's friends have all got social media accounts to say, no, you can't have one. And I also think it's very, very difficult to educate people that young, and because there are loads of different parents with different time availabilities and so forth. If you look at other things, we restrict the age that people can vote, have alcohol, the legal age for sex and things. We recognise regularly that kids are growing up and they can't have all the full rights of adults until they're sufficiently mature. But overall, I think parents need help.
They do. That seems to be the consensus. Dana, what do you think?
I think we live in a digital age and I think we have to accept that. And I'm a mother of 3 teenagers and there are a lot of positives to social media where they connect with all different kinds of people. You used to just stay in your year group in your own school and now, you've got access to a much wider group. But I think there needs to be a lot more education and I think the public schools banning the phones in school hours this year was a really good step. And I just think, education for parents, education for kids, and more regulation. But we do live in a digital age. We can't ignore that fact.
Aye.
And we give 9-year-olds complex, maths problems to solve. Surely they can, with some education, we can, help them navigate the digital world.
I mean, look, I think the overall consensus is parents need help navigating this. It's a real tough one. Tanvia, Ahmed, Claire, good to be with you. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you are struggling, please reach out to Lifeline 13 11 14. Well, it's become part of Aussie life. Mortgage holders wait with bated breath every month for the RBA to hand down its rates decision. 13 rate hikes since May 2022. And it's had a huge impact. The Coalition and Greens are pushing for Jim Chalmers to keep the Treasurer's emergency power to override RBA rate calls. But the proposal has been rejected by former RBA governors Ian Macfarlane and Bernie Fraser, and former Federal Treasurer Peter Costello, as well as academics and think tanks. They argue the overall power has never been used and could only be useful in resolving a potential once or twice a century crisis where there are irreconcilable differences between the bank and the democratically elected government. But in this cost of living crisis, should a government have the power to intervene? Our next question for the jury: should the government be able to override RBA interest rate decisions? Joining me is Dr. Mark Humphrey-Jenner, UNSW School of Banking. He argues no, along with Warren Hogan, Chief Economic Advisor at Judo Bank, who says yes. Hi to you both. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Mark, why should the government not be able to override RBA rate decisions?
The main reason for that is because, well, do we really trust Jim Chalmers or Anthony Albanese to make this decision? Do we trust them to not act myopically? Do we trust them to actually act in our best interests rather than just getting re-elected and funneling talking points down all of our throats as they're trying to perhaps persuade us that their short-term decision is actually in our best interests when it really isn't? And that fundamentally is the problem.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point, Warren. What do you think? Why are you arguing the other way?
Well, I think that these emergency powers, which they have at the moment, but which the RBA review suggested they should be removed to make sure the RBA is truly independent, because this is the whole argument. Is the RBA independent of the government? And these emergency powers are critical in a democracy because a democracy survives on checks and balances, and this is the ultimate check for the RBA. If you remove the ability of the parliament or the government to intervene if the RBA goes off-piste, which, as you said, was a once-in-a-century potential event, then you're removing a critical check from our democracy. So I think that is a fundamental argument for why these powers need to be retained. In fact, I think there is also this issue, which has become very trendy, particularly with this government, but over the course of the last decade, is that the government washes its hands of what the RBA does. They're the independent Reserve Bank, They are only operationally independent. This has been done all around the world for the last 30 years to stop politicians making bad short-term decisions with interest rates, that is to pump prime an economy or not get on top of inflation in a timely way. But that's just operationally. They are not independent fundamentally. The government has a convention where they have a memorandum of understanding at the start of each term. And, of course, they talk to each other all the time. The idea that these emergency powers are removed is undemocratic. And I think it sort of reeks of this government wanting even more of a reason to be able to distance itself from what the RBA is doing.
That's an interesting point. Undemocratic, lack of independence. What do you think?
All right, so I definitely agree with Warren about the government having a vital role in inflation. The government spending too much money is why inflation can occur. We can look at that in the US, where we had massive stimulus driving inflation. The government is often the cause of a lot of economic problems, and they shouldn't be let off the hook. They shouldn't be able to say it's the RBA's fault. They shouldn't be able to scapegoat Philip Lowe. They shouldn't be able to say Michelle Bullock did all of this and it's not our fault at all. The government needs to take responsibility. But that can be done in a way that doesn't give them control over the RBA. The problem with that, and I definitely understand Warren's point that we need to be able to have a check and balance on the RBA. The thing is, the way you design that check and balance matters. So if you just let the government, in theory, to go and intervene whenever they want, they can intervene in a short-term way that makes them look good right now but isn't in our long-term interests. The problem we face is what's happened in Turkey, where President Erdogan could intervene all the time, and then you end up with incredibly low interest rates while inflation goes to 80%. That's what happens when the government can intervene.
And then after he's re-elected, the interest rates go up.
Yes.
And of course, that's an example of the extremes and the worst of it. But I think our democracy and our fourth estate is so well advanced that I don't think any government would dare to do that. In fact, it's almost to the point of what you're making, is that the RBA doesn't do what they do in isolation. In fact, they have to deal with the fiscal policy, the wages policy. They have to deal with the whole economic environments thrown at them. And to have the government given more excuses to sit back and feel like it's not their responsibility, I think is counterproductive to creating good policy all around. So I think, if anything, we should be putting some pressure onto the government, particularly this government, not only to explain what the RBA is doing and provide real leadership, because that's really what they should be doing here. They should be telling the community the RBA is raising rates for this reason and it's in our best long-term interests.
Yeah.
But you could go a step further and say, well, maybe the government should be asked to give the green light on what's going on more regularly so that they can't wash their hands.
Let's get some juror feedback now. Rob, what do you think?
Tough question.
Yeah.
Always the independence of the RBA is primary, but I always hark back to Kerry Packer when he fronted the Senate committee saying, you guys don't do a good enough job that I should tip you. Those guys don't do a good enough job that I should give you extra powers. Anything that gives them a little bit of extra, I'm against. So I'd keep the independence of the RBA at all costs for mine.
Fair enough. Bruce, where do you sit on this?
Yes, I think emergency powers are necessary and should be retained, but any other form of involvement by the government would be analogous to giving the fox the keys to the hen house, I think.
That's an interesting analogy. Mark, what's your response to that?
Well, I agree with that analogy. It is akin to giving the fox the keys to the hen house or putting Dracula in charge of the blood bank, right? The other problem as well is I agree with Warren that the government could, in theory, explain to the population why the rates needed to be increased or decreased or whatever the case might be. My concern, and it's a fundamental concern with the current government, but also with governments in general, is they're often the biggest source of misinformation. Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers are the biggest sources of misinformation at the moment. It's not the media, it's not social media, it's not random commentators. It's the government. And if the government is putting up misinformation, for example, they did this about stage 3, they did this about superannuation.
Sure.
They've done this about a lot of things. Why wouldn't they just do this about interest rates?
Well, we'll stand by and wait for the budget to be handed down and then we'll have that conversation again. But look, it's time to call on the jury now. Jurors, you have 10 seconds to decide, should the government be able to override RBA interest rate decisions? OK, jury members, what have you decided? We've got 3, 4 yeses and the rest of you say no. Yvonne, in the middle there, why?
Well, and sort of if it's not broken, why fix it? I mean, it's not like any politicians have interfered with the Reserve Bank. And in a democracy, I really think the buck should always stop with those who are elected. So we can kind of assume, well, the Reserve Banks have been quite reasonable so far, but who knows whether we'll get some rogue Reserve Bank in the future. And then you want the power to be in the elected officials to do something about it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you raised. Robin, up the back.
Yes.
Where do you sit on this?
Well, I think for the government to interfere, they have the reserve powers, but to interfere, I don't think that's the way we should go.
And Rachel?
I agree with Mark. I can see politicians and governments being opportunistic by having this power, most definitely.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It goes back to basically your point earlier. Mark, Humphrey, Jenna and Warren Hogan, always good to speak with you both. Thank you for joining us on the panel this evening.